Hello folks, it's nice to welcome you back to, for those of you who are coming back to stage 2 at the Scottish AI Summit this afternoon. I'm John Fotheringham, AI Policy Manager in the Scottish Government Digital Director, and I'm the stage host. And I'd just like to welcome you all to this panel discussion of what AI could offer people as they get older and what is the role of co-design, which is an interesting twist on considering the principles in the AI strategy include UNICEF's policy guidance on AI for children, is to look at what AI can mean for people as they get older. So I hope you have an interesting discussion this afternoon, and please feel free to take part in submitting Q&A. And I'd just like to hand over to the panel chair, Professor Ram from the University of Edinburgh. Thank you. Have a good discussion.
Thank you. It's good to see you all. Good afternoon, and welcome to this session. I think if I'm counting correctly, this is only my second in-person session, since all of the lockdowns and us being locked away. It feels really good to see people in 3D and live, and I'll come back to this feeling in just a minute. But let me first introduce the panel. So we are here joined by colleagues with different experiences, different expertise, and different perspectives on the problem, which is exactly how panels ought to be. So to introduce myself, I'm a professor in the School of Informatics. I'm a technologist, so I come from the area of robotics, machine learning, but with a very strong interest in trying to apply that in human-centered systems and in applications such as health and social care. I'm joined, as I said, by a diverse panel, colleagues with interesting experiences. To start with, we have Dr. Cara Wilson, who's a research fellow in design. She's part of the Advanced Care Research Center, which is a big initiative on social care within the University of Edinburgh. She's also part of the Design Informatics program. We've already had some issues with COVID and health and disruptions, as you might imagine. So we were going to be joined by Jenny Robertson, who's the Patient and Public Involvement Coordinator within ACRC, but unfortunately she's not able to be here. And standing in, we have Lucy McLuhan, who's the Program Manager, also part of the ACRC. She's going to be joining us remotely. We have Joe Turnbull, who interestingly is not part of the university and so brings us really fresh perspectives. And when we were practicing, she told us that she really identifies herself as a farmer who thinks about just life in general, unencumbered by the academic things we think about. And we really look forward to that kind of a perspective of just thinking about life. And then on the panel, we had Professor Jacques Fleureau, who's a professor along with me in the School of Informatics, who's also unable to be here. So his thoughts are going to be channeled through Lucy. And last but not the least, we have Sohan Seth, who's a senior data scientist in the School of Informatics and also comes from the area of machine learning. So what are we here to talk about? So the core question is, we are interested in thinking about aging. Now the title of the panel, as you would have seen, began with what can AI do? But maybe let's first start with what is the AI for? The AI is for the people. And a fact of life is that we are all going to age. I mean, this is not really up for discussion. We are all aging, and that's that. I mean, there's a fixed endpoint, and as my colleagues like to say, you take different paths to the endpoint, but we all know the endpoint. So what do we really seek in this process of, trying to go through aging? We don't really want to think about aging as a problem. Academics and many people in the sector often talk about the problem of aging, but it's not really a problem, that's just life. So what we're really asking is, what is it that changes as we age? And perhaps one of the needs that becomes very salient as we age is the fact that we begin to lose connection, and we are in search of connections with other people and kind of trying to find ways in which the difficulties that naturally arise physically or in terms of social connections and so on, somehow we want to be able to cope with that, right? So that is where we want to go. And so really the question should have been framed as, given that that's what we want out of life, what can technology do, and in particular, what can AI do with respect to that? And so that's why we have, the mix between technology and, people who are thinking about the problem more broadly. But all of this sits within a landscape. And the landscape is the fact that health and social care comes with costs, budgetary implications, policy decisions, and so on. And this is why perhaps it's sometimes talked about as though it is a problem. So the numbers I have, I was reading about it recently. So since the 1950s, public spending on health has gone up tenfold. And if you view it as a fraction of GDP, it's still doubled. So clearly there's a lot of financial implication around this. And if you focus specifically on social care, even that, and even more recently, if you look at social care since the 2000s, it's still gone up by roughly around 6% in terms of the amount of money that's being spent. Except recently, in the recent years, it's actually started to taper off a little bit because of various policy decisions. What this means is that there is a desire to kind of, whatever it is we are doing around care, for it to be done efficiently in the sense of economics, policy, and so on. And in many ways, this is where technology enters the mix, right? So as people, we all want the best life for each of us. But placed with these constraints, technology enters the mix, and we are being forced to ask, could there be efficiencies? Could there be ways in which the process could be streamlined, and so on and so forth? And all of this is happening at a time when, in fact, AI, specifically as one subset of technology, has really taken off. I studied for my PhD starting from 2001, and at around that time when we were entering AI, it was still very much in the nascent stages compared to how you see it today. Today it's exploded, and even small kids on the street know what we mean by AI and so on. And it has exploded because it has sort of finally started to work in a way that previously it didn't, and it has kind of plugged into what would have previously been just considered digitization, IT infrastructure. So AI has reached the point that we can do all of that. And so what we are really asking is, to what extent can those kinds of technologies meaningfully plug into what is ultimately a human question about what we want in our lives? And how should we go about this process of reconciling these differences, addressing the tension, and doing it in such a way that it doesn't stick out in our faces and it kind of seamlessly blends into our lives? So I will stop speaking there, and I will hand over to my colleague, Kara, who's going to pick up and talk to us about issues of design to start with.
Thank you, Ram. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, ish. Is that all right? Yeah, I was told the microphone's working all right, so hopefully you can hear me okay now. Yeah. Thank you, Ram. As Ram said, I'm Cara Wilson. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow in human-computer interaction at the Advanced Care Research Centre at the University of Edinburgh. And today I'm going to be giving a quick overview of co-design and its pertinence in AI. So co-design follows the logic that the people for whom a technology is intended should be included in and indeed foregrounded in its design. So real people, such as the public, or in the case of today's panel, older adults, are experts in their own lived experience, and we think this means that they should therefore be involved in the design of the technologies that are going to be impacting their everyday lives. So in co-design, the idea is that those with lived experience and those with professional expertise are equals. That may sound relatively simple, but in reality, the huge amount of technologies that are designed are just done so without really any involvement whatsoever from people with lived experience. And so this can lead to really quite ingrained and pervasive issues regarding the technologies which emerge and those which are actually needed, and often there's quite a lot of disparity between the two. Co-design can be seen as a bit of a mediator between these two factors, so between what's technologically feasible as deemed by experts and what is actually desired by people. Or another way of saying that is that what's technologically feasible isn't always desired by people. And we, as designers, technologists, researchers, etc., have a responsibility to make sure that what people want is actually integrated into the rise of things like AI, which will be impacting their and our lives for a long time to come. And the idea then is that the resultant technology will be a lot more relevant and will be better integrated and appropriated into people's lives. So what is co-design exactly? It's not really a specific method or methodology, but rather it's an ethos. It's a sort of mindset regarding inclusion, representation, and agency. So in co-design approaches, user and participants will sort of co-design and co-analyze technologies alongside technologists, researchers, etc., to lead to more collaborative outcomes. Co-design itself has two fundamental tenets, and these are concerned, first of all, with pragmatism. So we want to make sure that the end product is something that's practically of use to the people who are going to use it, but also power. So making sure that participants have shared power and control in the design process. So through co-design, we make decisions and set research agendas with, not for, people. But let's have a look at the challenges with AI and co-design. Firstly, there's a lot of complexity in AI system design. And the discourse around this is very often for experts, by experts. Even things like explainable AI don't necessarily mean explainable to the general public. And the way that AI systems and sort of models are used make it really quite hard to include non-experts in the conversation. So to remedy this, through co-design practice, we aim to sort of provide the right tools, the right situations, the right settings to include people in the design process. So this often involves thinking really creatively, sometimes quite playfully, and taking the time to understand the language of participants themselves, rather than imposing our own expert language on them. Language, as they say, is power, and it's our job to start to devolve some of that power to participants. Only then do we then begin to sort of understand participant perspectives and really start to measure whether what we're doing and designing is actually relevant in terms of the AI that we're producing. So how do we co-design? Co-design approaches, as I said, it's more of a mindset, so there's no set way to co-design, but most approaches have a sort of commonality in that they are quite explorative, they're qualitative, they're iterative, they're really collaborative. So this might include things that are quite simple, like interviews and focus groups, where we go and sort of use ethnographical techniques to embed ourselves in the everyday lives of participants to understand where there's opportunities and areas that we could better design. But it also could be things like designing quite creative workshops where we use engaging activities and materials to really facilitate in-depth conversation around AI and to produce prototypes that we can then go on to develop further. So just a few considerations before I finish up. A really big issue in co-design is that it can be used very tokenistically as a sort of buzzword that's added on at the end of a project to tick boxes on participation. And this obviously isn't real co-design. So if you're wondering when to co-design, the answer is as early as possible, before, during, after, and always. And the idea is that these conversations are then continued in perpetuity to make sure that the AI, which evolves from what we're doing, continues to be ethical, inclusive, and representative. Thanks.
It's Lucy now. Lucy.
Oh, yes. So will Lucy be projected onto that? Yeah.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you. So I'm here in place of Jenny Robertson, so thank you very much for inviting us along. So at the Advanced Care Research Centre, which Jenny and I both work at, we're very unusual, but also very fortunate in having a very well-funded patient and public involvement engagement resource, which is normally in the form of Jenny Robertson, who's not here. But anyway, we're very, very well funded for this kind of thing. So our goal is to ensure that people are involved in all stages of research. So we're not just looking at what's actually being researched, not just the intervention, but we're looking at everything from the start to the end of the research process. And in this way, we really complement the kind of work that Kara's just been talking about. So ideally, this starts before any research at all is done. And to do this, we need to find out from people, in our case, people in later life, and those who care for them. So that might be people who are caring for them formally or informally. And we talk to them about what they think we should be even researching in the first place. So this could be particular health or care challenges that they face, or it could be particular solutions that they think we need to be looking at. And as Kara mentioned, this is sometimes, in fact, is often very different to what the researchers or the expert think is important to people. And because we can't look at everything, we ask people to prioritise what's important to them, and we guide our research efforts accordingly to make sure that what we're researching is actually going to be of benefit to people at the end of the day. So a particular feature of working in the sphere of artificial intelligence, which doesn't come into all research activities that we look at, is the issue of sharing information or sharing data about people, especially if it's particular to one person's activities, and in particular if it comes from routinely gathered data. So it's essential to understand exactly what information people are happy to be shared and who with. That's really important. Are they trustworthy? We need to know about this in a research context, but we also need to know about it in the real world, as ultimately we want the research that we're doing to have an impact and ultimately be used by people in later life and those caring for them. So we need to work really closely with the end users when thinking about what is challenging to them in the first place, how they view data sharing, and also what kind of interventions would be useful or acceptable to them. So in that way, what we do complements the work that Cara was talking around co-design, because it kind of wraps around it from beginning to end. So in the Advanced Care Research Centre and our associated projects around artificial intelligence, we do this in a number of ways. In our AI multimorbidity programme, we included patient and public involvement when we actually applied for funding in the first place. So we had people right from the start defining what our overarching research questions would be and to make sure that they're the right ones, so that we're applying for money for things that people are actually interested in that might help them at the end of the day. We also have lay members in our advisory boards so that we have involvement in the direction and the oversight of the research. But really crucially for the topic we're discussing this afternoon, we also have small patient and public involvement groups for each strand of the work that we're doing. We have a network of 30 lay members who are involved. And we have small groups of lay members who meet regularly to give detailed and focused feedback on the development of the interventions we're researching and how we're researching them, how we collect data, how we use the data. This is not just done between lay members and our patient and public involvement worker, Jenny. In fact, Jenny simply acts as a facilitator in this process, where researchers themselves get face-to-face interaction with the lay members so they can really iterate the interventions and processes as they're being developed. And so to give an example of how this works from the lay member perspective, I'm handing over to Jo.
Okay, thank you very much, Lucy. Hello, everyone. As Ram said at the beginning, I'm very much a lay person. I'm not one of the academics and erudite speakers you've probably been hearing earlier this morning. In fact, if anything, you could probably describe me as technologically challenged. I did work for quite a few years in the NHS, but in a non-executive capacity, and I'm certainly not used to public speaking. But as Ram said, at heart, I'm a farmer. And so if you ask me what AI says, I would say artificial insemination. So the first lesson of inclusivity, don't use acronyms. Anyway, I didn't think that's what Jenny wanted me to talk about, so I looked it up. Artificial intelligence. And honestly, I wasn't that much wiser. In fact, what sprung to mind was little green men from Mars running about. But anyway, I read a little bit more and I began to understand and to realise just how much of my day-to-day life it affects. For a start, two of my colleagues, as you know, aren't here today. So Lucy's having a very short notice to stand in for them. Both of them tested positive for COVID. What's a lateral flow test but a medical device? Artificial intelligence. I bet there's very few here today who haven't used one in the last 24 hours. As far as I personally am concerned, artificial intelligence has put me in charge of managing my own healthcare. I have type 2 diabetes, which suddenly went haywire last year. I now have a little bit of kit, about half the size of a mobile phone, which tests my blood glucose levels twice a day. If they're low, I know I mustn't eat something sweet. If they're high, I mustn't. That's a bit simplistic, but whatever, it means I'm in charge. I can decide what to do and whether that piece of cake is worth it. The second thing is another device, even smaller, called a pulse oximeter. The majority of you will know exactly what I'm talking about, as it's invariably used when you have your blood pressure taken just something that you clip on your finger, which tells you how much oxygen is in your blood. My GP offered me one when I had COVID at Christmas, so I could monitor my own oxygen levels. 98 to 100 apparently is ideal. Drop below 92 and you should start to worry. Get into the 80s and you need to think seriously about going into hospital. Most people who are in hospital with COVID have low oxygen levels and need to be on a ventilator. With this little device, I can forestall an emergency admission, or indeed be reassured that I don't need hospital admission at all, thus saving the NHS time and money as well. Although I'm well over 70, I'm fortunate in that my husband and I are both active, reasonably fit, and have children and grandchildren living close by who are always popping in to see that we're okay. Many older people, however, live alone. They're in poor health, they're unsteady on their feet and vulnerable, but they like living in their own home. They're independent-minded, they don't want to go into care. Yet another little AI gadget is their lifeline, that little button that they wear on a lanyard around their neck. If they have a fall or they take a turn, they just have to press the button and an alarm immediately sounds at a call centre which identifies the caller and sends out assistance. Of course, there are huge and mind-boggling technological advances that you hear about in the media. The complicated operations that are carried out by a robot, manipulated by a surgeon watching a screen. The remote diagnosis and treating of all sorts of serious conditions. But speaking for myself and for most of my contemporaries, it's the small things that help us to keep control of our own health and to live where we want to, rather than being more and more dependent on others as we get older. It's the little things that matter. So I'll now pass you back to Lucy, who this time is standing in for Jacques Florio, and she's talking about how technology can make life easier. So back to Lucy.
Thanks, Jo. So now I'm being Jacques and talking about some of the technological work that he is doing as part of the Advanced Care Research Centre. So the impact of artificial intelligence is increasing across most spheres of society, and much is said and written about its dangers, sometimes overshadowing its benefits to people and society. In the Advanced Care Research Centre, and more particularly in one of our work packages, which is called New Technologies of Care, we believe in harnessing the potential of artificial intelligence at a number of levels in order to build technologies and tools that can help complement and improve older people's care so that they lead independent lives. With this in mind, we're designing new types of intelligent sensors and devices that are adapted to people in later life. This involves working with them to understand their conditions, their needs and their wishes, so that the devices that monitor their health and activities fit to their lives rather than the other way around. And again, that very much echoes what Cara was talking about earlier on. So we're faced with big questions such as what is acceptable and what is suitable to people, and how do we respect their privacy and so on. For instance, while wearables like this watch might be fine for some people if they're younger or fitter or used to wearing these devices for other reasons, that might be fine. But we can't assume that this is going to be the case for somebody who's older, who's frailer, who suffers from multiple long-term conditions, or who just might not be used to that kind of technology. So a large part of our engineering effort is currently on designing contactless sensors, which over time will intelligently adapt to the person they're monitoring. Building devices and collecting data are not enough, though. We really need to make sure that they're useful. So our efforts are also on designing, implementing and deploying appropriate artificial intelligence that can work with data while incorporating an understanding of the individual and their care needs so that we can make trustworthy predictions. For instance, just because someone doesn't move for a while in the afternoon, this should not necessarily trigger an alert if our artificial intelligence model already knows that this person usually takes a bit of a nap on the couch after lunch. Our approaches will not only aim to detect sudden, often traumatic events such as falls, but also work on predicting longer-term physical and cognitive decline by looking at data over time. By building an understanding of the individual, the data and the processes associated with their care, we can devise artificial intelligence algorithms that can provide clear explanations of the root causes for observed behaviours and events. With such an understanding, we hope to be more effective at the intervention end, where we'll produce AI-backed technologies that are suitable both to care.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. It's nice to be here. And as Ram pointed out, I also left my home office for the first time in 2 years. So good to see all the people here. So as Ram pointed out, I'm Sohan. I'm the senior data scientist at the School of Informatics here at the University of Edinburgh. And although the slide did not say it, I'm also part of the Advanced Care Research Center, where I'm leading one of the work packages on data-driven insight and prediction. And in my talk today, briefly, I'll discuss how we can build AI models with the end users in mind and with them. So to start with, as Cara and Ram pointed out in their opening statements, the goal of what we are doing is to derive knowledge from data. But while doing it, we want to guide the process with domain expertise. And we want to do that because as data scientists, we might not have critical domain knowledge that the other people might have who are living through it. And this is quite particularly useful when designing models for the older adults, because they often have unique lived experience, which we don't as younger generation. One of the examples is living with multiple chronic conditions or living on multiple drugs for a very long time. And those lived experience are never there if we don't include them explicitly in terms of the modeling. So to give you a quick example, one of the problems that we're interested in developing tools for is prognosis or risk prediction. Here the idea is that we want to assess your risk or older adults' risk of certain adverse outcomes. For example, the risk of fall, the risk of emergency hospital admission, and other things. And we want to do that based on the data at hand, the survey data, the routine data we have. So the goal here is that we want to build a predictive model that can predict whether you might have an adverse outcome in the near future based on the variable we have at hand. And we want to do it as accurately as possible. And I'm going to briefly talk about how we can include the end users or older adults while developing these models. So one of the areas where their involvement is quite critical, as Jenny pointed out, or Lucy pointed out in Jenny's talk, is how do we select the outcome of interest? For example, we as data scientists can select an outcome, but it might not have any practical implication for actually who will be using those models in practice. So we need to talk to them whether predicting certain outcome is important for them or not. And that is true when you're predicting a single outcome. But it might also be that when you are using the model, you might be interested in more than one outcome of interest. For example, if you are trying to see how effective a drug is, while checking that, you might be also interested in knowing what kind of side effect I might have when using that drug. So having that conversation and selecting outcome is quite critical. Once the outcome is selected, we want to build a model, as I said, from the variable, which can predict the outcome. And there also, since the end users are the ones who will be using the model and they are directly impacted by the decision made by the model, it is quite critical for them to understand how the model is working. And that depends on having a conversation between us, a continuous conversation, while developing the model on how we are learning the model, how we are training the model, how we are validating it, how we are calibrating the model, what kind of uncertainty we can quantify in the model, also how the decision is being taken by the model, and also if things change. For example, certain variables are missing and certain things are not there and slightly different, then how my outcome will be affected by those changes. And understanding this can build trust in the end user while they are using that model. Similarly, the end user can also be influential in choosing the right variables that we are putting inside the model. As data scientists, when we are building complicated model, we can definitely put as many variables as we want in the model. But the problem there is that not all variables are relevant, and our choice of variables can often be directed because of what variable we have in the dataset at hand. But having the end user in mind, they can choose what sort of other variables they might want to include in the model. For example, as Joe pointed out, loneliness is a variable they might think is predictive of certain adverse outcome in the future. And if we include that variable in the model, that can be useful. And also the sensor measurement being developed by Jack's team, if we want to include them, that might improve our prediction accuracy. So there are different ways we can involve the end user in each of these steps when designing the model and deploying it. And I think it is quite essential to do that, especially designing models for older adults. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks to all of my panelists for their excellent contributions. At the same time, you all have been contributing, and we have a list of questions. So we're going to switch gears and start taking some of these questions. So continue to keep your questions coming. But I'm going to start with one that is directly, immediately very interesting. And I'm going to read because some of the wording is quite important here. So the aging tsunami is more about multimorbidity than age. And multimorbidity, of course, means that conditions come together and the interactions between them are important. So the question is, could AI help in a preventative role over a 30 to 50-year lifespan so that we see radical reduction in multimorbidity? Or is this impossible to achieve in our democracy's 5-year life cycle? This actually goes to some extent to points that Sohan was bringing up. So maybe I'll begin with you if you're okay with taking the first stab.
To predicting whether it can be useful, and in 30 to 50 years probably will be a bit out of depth for me, but I can mention that we do have a related grant, what Lucy mentioned, funded by NIH, called the MSISC, where we are trying to characterize what multimorbidity means in our life, how it is influenced by socioeconomic variable genetic factors, and what are their implications in the healthcare system. So on that note, I would definitely say that in 30 to 50 years, we can address the challenge because we are putting a lot of effort in there, not just University of Edinburgh, but also it's a consortium of funding by the NIH, where multiple universities involved between about 8 to 9 different grants. So yes, I would say why not? It's possible.
And can I also invite another contribution, perhaps from Lucy, who might have thoughts on this?
I guess I would agree with, or I'd echo what Sohan has said. I mean, I think obviously, there was the issue about the, 5-year plus situation. I mean, certainly the work that we are doing, we have long-term funded programs. It would definitely be beyond a 5-year funding cycle, I think. I'm not sure if I would be quite as optimistic as Sohan in terms of predicting 50 years hence. But definitely more than 5 years. I think we're not really constrained by those democratic cycles, certainly in terms of the research work that we're doing. It takes a long time to do what we're doing, and we can certainly look beyond that. So, I mean, I think my estimate would be maybe 10, 15, 20 years beyond that. And the initial point that was made in the question about, is this more about multimorbidity rather than aging? Well, kind of, but multimorbidity increases with age. The older you get, the more long-term conditions you're likely to get. So the two kind of go hand in hand, really.
Excellent. So another question. So the poorest people in Scotland experience over 20 years of poor health. This kind of goes back to the original point of we all know the end point, but the path we take is different. And if the latter years of life are not so good, and if the latter years are really, we're talking 20, 25 years of ill health, what can AI do to address this? Any thoughts from my colleagues? So this is one where maybe I might take the prerogative and say, I work in AI as well, so maybe I'll kickstart the answers here. So connected with the previous point about, can we predict multimorbidity? There's also the question about, can we characterize what it is that we have? Prediction's a hard problem. The future is difficult. But can you at least say something about the present? well enough that the interventions are meaningful. That, I think, we might be able to do somewhat better, or at least, we have a little bit more hope of being able to say something about, this is the data I've seen, what am I really stripping out of that? And if we do a good job of that, and if we democratize it to the point that it actually gets out there at the point of care, towards the terminal ends of the points of care, then maybe we could at least shrink these years. I mean, there are many factors contributing to the fact that it's 20 years, but maybe at least we can make an impact and start to shrink it and start to kind of distribute it. But other thoughts?
Yeah, I would say just one thing that I was thinking about when preparing this talk was about some of maybe the pitfalls or the challenges that might come along with AI and co-design, which is my area of expertise. And I was thinking, it does take a long time to really integrate the mindset of co-design and involvement and inclusion of people who are not experts in any sort of technology design. So having this sort of 20-year gap or the 30 to 50 years period to make impact, I think gives us a lot of opportunity to really integrate co-design thinking into our processes. And there's a lot of co-design is about understanding people's context in the moment. So we go into communities and understand in an embedded way what's happening now in terms of health outcomes, multimorbidity, things like that, and really understand people's stories, exactly like the gorgeous vignettes that Joe was sharing. We really want to understand that now, but the beauty is that we can also use this current understanding to extrapolate and think towards the future and really understand people's aspirations for their futures, for the future of technology and the future of society as well.
Mm-hmm. We have another question that should come to you first, Cara. And this is actually a pair of questions, so I'm going to kind of combine them. So the first point was, can racial and gender bias in health systems and data be mitigated using co-design? And there's another question that they have moved around, which has to do with the fact that there's diversity in the population, especially in an older population. And to what extent can that, which is a different aspect of this, be taken into account within co-design, and how should it be done?
I think that's an amazing question. And I think if I'd had longer, I would have talked a lot about diversity. So I think naturally, through its sort of inclusive mindset, co-design is all about including people in the process of design. So we've been over that. But the fact is that the people who want to get involved often are people who have computers and can see an advert that we put online that asks you to be involved and come along to participate in those types of things, which is fantastic. It's lovely to get people involved, but a lot of the time that means that there's still people who, for example, don't have access to the internet, who are falling through the cracks. And those are perhaps, the more that happens, the bigger the divide becomes, until it's this gulf where people who can participate are, and even that is difficult to get off the ground. But in the meantime, there's these people who are being left behind because of lots of different ingrained societal, political issues. And I think that's a really massive factor to consider in co-design. And we're really striving to include as many different types of people as possible. But it is a really, really big struggle.
And Joe, you brought up the very similar points when you started out. What do you think about the question?
I mean, looking in our area, certainly the most deprived people are those with the greatest health problems. I know that's a generalisation, but it is what usually happens. And they don't have access to technology, as you say, so they can't participate. So we are responsible for trying to find out how we can involve them, because it's all very well having the sort of better educated and those with more money having an input, but that possibly isn't the majority that have certain conditions. So it's up to us to think of ways to get to them. Not quite sure how.
Yeah. So there's another kind of, I guess, socio-political question that's interesting in the mix here. So one of the largest issues of Scottish labour market, this questioner says, is insufficient productivity. And the expectation is that the workforce is growing, but it's not being, quite so productive. So the question is, can AI be used to ensure the transition of older people into these new industries and sectors in a way that's smooth, whatever smooth might mean? Any thoughts? Maybe we could start with you, Suhan, if you're brave enough to take this on.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we, when we started working on SCRC, that Scotty pointed out with the director of SCRC, is that we are interested is kind of in the last 3 years of somebody's life. That is, so I don't know if we can bring people back into the workforce in the last 3 years of their life. But I guess if we look at technology, then technology can definitely help in the example of COVID, work from home that we never did before. So I think there are different opportunities that can be created. So especially if you want to get involved into work to increase your well-being or decrease your loneliness, as Joe pointed out. And AI definitely can be helpful there, so it can assist you in doing so rather than you doing everything on your own. But again, it depends on which aspect of your life you're talking about when you're talking about older adults and what the intervention that you're aiming for in doing so.
And may I also ask Lucy, do you have any thoughts on this, especially from the perspective of, the large initiatives such as ACRC and its effect on how exactly we are addressing these social questions?
Absolutely. So, our focus, as Sohan says, is on people in the last 3 years of their lives, but obviously that's often very difficult to predict. But we do work with 2 other really major multi-million-pound programmes that are looking at people during their working lives. So one is actually called Healthy Working Lives, and another one is called 10,000 Steps. And these are major programs that are actually looking at making the workplace healthier for people, maybe in the later stages of their working lives. So I wouldn't say they're particularly using AI, but they're certainly using data science in those areas and making the best of data in terms of looking at how to make the workplace healthier for people at the later stages of their career, but particularly with one of the projects making people who work in the care workforce better able to work in that area during their lifetimes as well. So, that's actually looking at 2 ends of this issue. It's the people who work in care homes, but also people who are at the latter stages of their career. So they're 2 major programs that we're working with as well, but they've very much kind of got a data science approach rather than what I would call an AI approach to them. But it's certainly a huge societal issue that we're involved with.
Thank you, Lucy. So with that, we've come to the end of our allocated time. There are a lot of very interesting questions here, but perhaps we should take them out for the coffee break and have more of a discussion outside. So it remains for me to thank the panel for their excellent contributions, and thank you all for attending and for participating through the Q&A. Thanks.